Good morning. I'm Alex Halliday, Director of Columbia University's Earth Institute, and I'm founding Dean of the new Columbia Climate School. I'd like to welcome you all to the second Managed Retreat Conference, a major initiative of the Columbia Climate School and the Earth Institute. This will be a truly diverse, important, and transformative week with events focused on the complex and nuanced issues of managed retreat. While we couldn't convene in person, hosting this virtually has allowed us to include over 50 sessions this week, with people joining us from around the country and the world. After the last meeting that was held in 2019, June 2019, I met with my colleagues, Bradley Horton and Alex Sherbinin, and said, why don't we actually do this again? Because this is going to be the kind of subject that people are going to need to have. There's going to be books written about this. There are going to be journals on managed retreat. Eventually, every university may have a department called managed retreat in 20 years' time. This is going to be such a big topic for society going forward that we need to think about how do we develop the academic space around it, things we need to talk about, and the individuals who need to be involved in that. And that's where this conference is particularly important, because it needs to bring in stakeholders from private and non-profit sectors, together with academics, scientists, and communities, to discuss what it means for people, infrastructure and ecosystems, but mainly people, as rising seas push back coastlines around the world. And of course, we deal with many other aspects of climate change, risk, and disaster. So we need to ask key questions about, even if you just take the issue of coastal communities, where should they move to and when should they move? Who pays for the relocation or who pays for the adaptation that's needed if you're going to stay put? How do you make sure that coastal retreat doesn't splinter communities and exacerbate inequalities? And while the conference was that we had in 2019 generated more questions and answers, it was helpful to hear from so many diverse perspectives to start discussing these complexities and forming a path forward. The goal of this week's conference is to continue these discussions and start to move more in the direction of equitable solutions. A major emphasis will be on issues of environmental justice, in recognition that the people most impacted by decisions around retreat must play a key role in those conversations going forward. Clearly, climate change is going to impact certain parts of society more than others, and typically it's disadvantaged communities that are going to be most severely impacted, and typically those communities that have had least to do with causing the problem in the first place. So I'd like to thank Alex Sherbinin and Bradley Horton of Lamont, Dr. Earth Observatory, and Season, who both helped organize this conference. I also want to thank Haley Martinez, who's done a huge amount of work behind the scenes to make this all happen, and the others on the steering committee who helped organize this massive virtual event this year. It's no secret that climate change is one of the most urgent, challenging, and complex problems, or array of problems facing humankind. Just if you look at the issue of sea level between now and 2100, sea level is predicted to rise at least 60 centimeters. But with increasing rates of ice loss that are now well documented as a result of very careful scientific research in the Antarctic, it's clear that this last decade, ice loss in Antarctica has doubled from the previous decade, and it's doubled from the previous decade before that. So there's an acceleration of ice loss, and we're not quite sure what the trajectory will be going forward. Some people say there could be as much as 2 meters of sea level rise in the future by 2100. And of course, the impacts of climate change are not just about sea level rise. Parts of the earth may become uninhabitable because of drought, wildfires, heat, etc., other heat stress, etc. So these are major issues that we've got to deal with and think about how are we going to prepare society for this. We have an international understanding of the issues of refugees from war, and there are rights that are enshrined in international law to address their needs. We don't have that for climate refugees yet, although there are frameworks being put in place which are very, very helpful to take this forward in the future. So you might ask, well, tell me about what's the climate school got to do with this? Well, we're building a climate school, which might seem a bit of a lame academic head in the sand kind of thing to do when the world's in having a disaster. There are those academics building a blooming school. Well, the idea of the climate school is it's there to try and address the issues of climate change, partly because Columbia is extremely strong in this subject area, but our work is spread out across very different parts of the university. So we want to bring that together into a powerful new entity, but also partly because we're going to make this climate school about the outside world. So it's not meant to be just about Columbia. It's meant to be a window, a portal into the outside world where we bring people in, not just to hear what clever people we are, but actually to learn from people from communities that are experiencing climate change. And actually very often they actually already know more about what to do about it than we do. And so there's a huge amount of work to be done like that. And the Managed Retreat Conference is a good example of why the climate school is so important. We don't build schools very often. We're just celebrating this year the centenary of the School of Social Work, School of Public Health, which was, I think, the first in the world pretty much. And of course, schools of public health developed 100 years ago because places like New York, London, etc., realized that the issues of health weren't just about medical treatment. They were about the environment in which people are living and the conditions under which people needed to build a healthy lifestyle. Otherwise, there would be pandemics, etc. So it ends up being a school of public health. Of course, it was around the time of the flu pandemic when so many people died, vastly more than from COVID. But it wasn't called a school of pandemics. It was a school of public health because there are so many different features that needed to be brought together to address the issues. And that's what the climate school will be like. It'll bring in people from engineering, politics, sociology, geosciences, of course, many other key subjects in the social sciences, but also the humanities that we're very keen to sort of engage. So this is great. We're looking forward to engaging with you further as we do this. It basically means we're going to have about 1,000 people working at Columbia in somehow related to the school going forward. We've already, we only just decided to do this a year ago. Our first students are arriving this fall. We're moving very fast and we're looking forward to engaging with people as we do it. One of the key things in closing to say is that, of course, climate change has to be interdisciplinary because we're talking about the many aspects of the way the natural world is being perturbed by humans. And actually the human part of it is massively important. It's pretty clear that we can't simply deal with these problems by coming up with some kind of whiz-bang technological solution. So for example, the Ebola crisis in Africa, the thing that actually really got things under control was, of course, medical interventions, but it was also social anthropology and understanding how people behave in those circumstances. And understanding how people behave is going to be key to solving the climate crisis, if there is such a thing as solving the climate crisis, learning how to deal with it and actually how to address the issues of adaptation. A lot of it's going to be around how people will react to things and how do we actually engage with them in terms of making sure they feel that they're bought into whatever it is that we're coming up with. So when it comes to managed retreat, the big issues are under what conditions is it necessary? What governance structures are going to be needed? Who's going to pay for it? Where are we going to retreat to? How can science help us make more informed decisions in these various areas? This is going to be a really great meeting. I hope you all have a wonderful time here. And we look forward, of course, to welcoming people in person. We're going to do it, I think, in a bigger venue than we did last year. But with that, I'd just like to thank everybody and hope you enjoy your conversations and discussions Universities are supposed to be places where people argue. They're not supposed to be places where people agree. So please feel free to engage, debate, be courteous, be polite. But actually the idea is to express yourself, get your views out there, and make people aware of things that they need to think about going forward. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Alex Sherbinin, who's Senior Research Scientist and Associate Director for Science Applications at Season in the Earth Institute, is one of the lead organizers of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, and appreciate your words, inspirational words to get us started. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will all go flawlessly. What can go wrong with technology, right? So I'll do this and see what happens. Hopefully you're seeing it in full screen mode. So welcome on behalf of the organizing committee and my co-chair of this conference, Radley Horton, to the second Managed Retreat Conference. And we're just really excited to have all of you here. I'm going to just go over a few items to get you ready for our week together, and starting with sort of where we were in 2019 and where we've come today. So 2019, we had 400 attendees, 150 speakers, and 30 sessions over 3 days. And in 2021, we have over double that number of attendees, almost double the number of speakers, and 53 sessions over 4 days. You'll notice that because of the pandemic, we're also going a little bit later into the evening because we wanted to accommodate people who might be in other time zones. So this virtual format, I think most of you are used to it by now, has its pros and cons, but we believe that we want to exploit its positive aspects to the maximum. So it's opened the door to a lot more international participation. We have participants from Wellington, New Zealand, London, Sao Paulo, Dhaka, and many other parts of the world. You'll hear a panel this morning involving mayors, or rather not mayors, but high-level officials from many parts of government and many cities around the world as well. The other aspect that we are going to do is at the end of this conference, we'll be sending out a poll or survey that we've constructed with colleagues from Virginia Tech, who are really interested in how virtual conferences can be best exploited moving forward, especially as we seek to reduce our carbon emissions. As academics, we contribute as much as anyone to those emissions. Media interest has picked up phenomenally, and we now have more than 60 journalists registered from a number of major news outlets. Just a word to those who are speaking that we have spoken to our press liaison at the Earth Institute, and just be aware that you could be quoted if you present something, so be aware of that. But we are encouraging all journalists in attendance to reach out individually to speakers to actually book a time to talk with you individually rather than just quote you ad hoc from your presentation. So we hope that will happen. I'll be describing in a moment how that can happen. And also we have a new administration, and this administration is making climate issues and environmental justice issues a top priority. So this creates a particularly exciting context in the United States for this conference. So who's here? We have, as I said, 850 registrants. In 2019, a lot of people said, hey, it would be great to have more government representatives. So we have a really healthy mix of government representatives from the local level, state, provincial, depending on where you are, and national level agencies, and we're excited by that. We have a lot of nonprofits. Obviously, we have our normal academic roster of participants, and then, as I mentioned, quite a number of journalists and reporters. We're also excited to have the younger generation. 20% of our participants are students, either at graduate or undergraduate levels. So that's really exciting for us to sort of bring along the next generation. In terms of logistics, everything that you need to know is going to be in the attendee hub. You'll find out information about all the sessions, and you'll have join links to each of the sessions that will go live at the time of this that the session is about to start. You can search by day, presenter, and keyword. You can add sessions to your personal agenda. I've already been using it, and it's, I think, fantastically helpful to organize your conference experience. If you want to schedule a virtual appointment with another attendee, just go to the attendee tab. You can search for the attendee, and then there's a little button next to it to say schedule an appointment. So that's very easy. If you are a presenter, you should have received an email from Haley Martinez that includes the word speaker logistics in the subject line. Search your spam filter if you did not receive that message, or reach out to Haley if you can't find it anywhere, because it's very important that you have that link to your session. When you speak, just to be clear, you will be in a normal type Zoom session, but it appears slightly differently to those who are on the outside, so to speak. And we're also going to be shuttling comments and other chat messages from the participants in the attendee hub to the speaker so that all of that gets seamlessly handled. So if you miss a session that you really wanted to join, it's very easy. After about 2 hours in the attendee hub, you will see a link that allows you to see the recorded version of that session. So we realize that there are sessions that are concurrent, and you may miss something as a result of that scheduling. And we did our best, obviously, but there's so much rich content that we wanted to accommodate that we now have up to 4 sessions, 4 concurrent sessions going on at a time in some slots. How do the networking sessions work? You will see a link to networking sessions during some of the breaks. Those live links will go live to the OEA platform that will be made available from the agenda, and some general networking. Some will be for general networking. Some will be, kind of round robin, speed dating type platform, and some will have topics and themes. So you'll be able to see on the agenda what the type of networking session is, and choose to join the ones that most interest you. We do hope you will avail yourself of that. We realize that that may be one of the few opportunities to really network with folks here at the conference. Lastly, I'll mention that a special issue of Science has just been released. You can actually download the entire issue free of charge from the platform on the homepage of the attendee hub. There's also a special session at 10:30 on Thursday where a number of the lead authors on this special issue will be presenting. Brad Weibel, the editor of the special issue at Science, attended the 2019 conference and was so impressed that he contacted a number of us to write papers. So there's a really exciting lineup of sessions. I cannot list all of them possibly, but here's a taste of some of the topics around climate change, displacement, colonialism, before you jump ship, how to engage coastal communities, climate insurance, how to explore divergent perspectives on just, fair, and equitable managed retreat, topics around buyouts. There's some international sessions, and finally, the youth voices for climate today, 4:45 to 5:15 Eastern time. We welcome you to join that. I think it'll be a really exciting. We have 2 excellent youth representatives who will speak to us. Last but not least, I want to say a big thank you to Haley Martinez, who's a senior program manager, and most of you have received communications from her already. She has been vital to the success of this conference, and we're so pleased that she returned from 2019 to take this on. And that she has really made sure that everything goes smoothly. So we are very, very appreciative of Haley. The entire Earth Institute Climate School communications team has also been behind the scenes working to ensure that communications go well and that people learn about this conference, and will be, tweeting and otherwise communicating with the public about events as they're happening live here at the conference. We thank all the student workers at the conference, in particular Jack Weissman and Sydney Williams, and Anna Lepresti, who worked with Radley Horton at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, also deserves a word of thanks for being a wise counsel during our many meetings, internal meetings. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the organizing committee. You can read the names for yourself, but we had an all-star cast of people, some of whom we will be hearing from during the course of the conference in plenary sessions. So we're very excited about that. So with that, I want to introduce our plenary speakers. And I'm going to stop sharing. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Jacqueline Patterson, who will be our first plenary speaker. Jacqueline is the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Since 2007, Jackie has served as coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. She has worked as a researcher, program manager, coordinator, advocate, and activist working on women's rights, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental and climate justice. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I look forward to having this conversation with you. I'm going to share my screen. And so I will be just, I guess we'll start kind of big picture, 30,000 foot, and then we'll winnow down. So I'll be talking about centering equity and justice in managed retreat, and really just kind of talking about some grounding considerations that we need to keep in mind. And as I say below, it's a warm-up act for AR Siders and Carlos Martin and Carl Anthony and others who will be speaking later, getting more into the details of how we do this. But I'll be talking about some of the considerations we need to think of as we center equity and justice in managed retreat. So just starting with this, when we talk about managed retreat, some of the critical questions that we have to keep in mind, just as with everything, is who is pulling the strings around just development in general, even in the context of managed retreat. Who is managing, who is being managed, who is paying the price for climate change and its impacts in terms of displacement, relocation, and so forth, and who is getting paid, again, even in the context of what would be well-meaning efforts, and who's making decisions throughout the process. So when we think about centering equity and justice, these are the critical grounding questions we have to keep in mind. We also have to keep in mind the history. When we talk about managed retreat in the United States, we have to remember that the history is also many vestiges in today. So when we talk about the founding of what's now called the United States, we know that it was founded through displacement, violent and murderous displacement. So when we talk about that, we have to kind of keep that in mind as we think about what's fair and what's just, as we think about what's even the same factors that cause the violent displacement then are the same factors that drove climate change that are resulting in the need for displacement now. And it's in some of the same communities and populations who were displaced at that time are the same populations who are most vulnerable when we talk about displacement now. And so when we look at that historical context, it's a rampant extraction, exploitation, and displacement, and it so from the impact on the people who are indigenous to this land, these territories that we now occupy, unceded territories, to the violent extraction of African Americans from Africa, brought over in the hulls of ships as cargo to then become the labor that built the infrastructure for this nation, to the ways that we violently extract natural resources, and use natural resources for generating energy and for other activities, and how that is at why we're here in terms of climate change. And we have to just keep all of this in mind as we think about, again, what's equitable and what's just. And then we have to keep in mind the trade, manufacturing, finance, labor, housing, and land policies that have benefited wealthy corporations, wealthy people, and when we talk about the history, white people, and in terms of the present day as well. We see how that still plays out. Here's a quote from Martin Luther King: "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few." And that is, unfortunately, the history and up until today. So when we talk about displacing and belonging, some of the unnatural disasters and societal accelerants that are driving the inequities and injustices. So we know, about disasters. We know, I won't go into kind of a lot of detail around this, but the disproportionate impact is everything from pre-existing vulnerabilities to the ways that disasters are handled post-disaster, and who is benefiting and who is paying the price again. We also know, when we talk about pre-existing vulnerabilities, that African-American and Latino people are more likely to be in flood zones, and therefore, again, more likely to be displaced, not only just in disasters, but as we think about sea level rise and its impact on where people are placed, and we see these impacts as well. And we know that actually this location and the lack of services and infrastructure is what resulted in so many people perishing in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and other disasters as well. And when we talk about sea level rise, that well, we all know, I think, the science around sea level rise. So these are all the factors that we think about. And when we think about the intersection of being displaced in floodplain and being disproportionately located in floodplains, and then we think about the inequities in infrastructure, this example is one that I often tout because it's so critical to this question. We're actually coming out with a report on this very topic around flooding and equity in flooding. But when we were in Louisiana after Hurricane Isaac in 2012, we saw that the Plaquemines Parish had been completely inundated, and wondered about the levee fortification that had happened in the 7 years since Hurricane Katrina. And someone on CNN asked the congressional representative for that area, Senator Mary Landrieu, about why it was that Plaquemines Parish didn't have the protections in terms of levee fortification. And she said she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question. And they said that they used a formula to decide which levees would be prioritized for fortification. And that formula points to each levee based on the likelihood of the level of economic impact that would happen if that levee was overtaken. So yes, when one does kind of a straight cost benefit analysis in terms of dollars, then that's one thing. But as we all know, that prioritization of dollars is literally at the sacrifice of people who need the protection the most. Dr. Robert Bullard wrote this book, Wrong Complexion for Protection. And these are the kind of dynamics that we have all too often in terms of how decisions are made around infrastructure. I showed this picture because it tells a story of, it's in Alabama in the aftermath of some tornadoes and flooding that happened in the area. And what struck me when I was there in this place where they were providing food was that every last person on the side that was giving out the food was white, and every last person on the side of the people that were receiving the food was African American. And it just struck me in terms of who was most impacted, who was able to bounce back, who may not have been impacted at all, or who may have been impacted, but they had enough cushion so that they were able to then move into service mode. But who were the folks who needed to be served? And that just says a lot about the dynamics. And this also plays into the same situation. This was outside that same facility. That's the facility in the background with the red brick. And it struck me here, taking this picture where everybody on stage was white, mostly male. And these are the folks from Red Cross, FEMA, local government. And lined up at the mic were the 3 African-American women who needed services, who needed information, who needed resources. And so this is the dynamic that we have in terms of who's in charge and who's in need. And so when we talk about kind of this notion of displacement and then even foundational belonging, as it relates to African-American experience, we've seen over the last year, this whole phenomenon, last couple of years, there's been kind of a rise in understanding of this phenomenon of this living while Black, where police were called after an African-American woman fell asleep at Yale University in the common room. Police were called when someone was in Starbucks, just a group of Black men were, or two Black men were in Starbucks. Police were called when a woman was checking out of the Airbnb. So just when people are just trying to live, then they're seen as out of place, and therefore they've become displaced, whether they've been arrested or otherwise, just when they're trying to do the things that other people just do normally. This is the Associated Press. This is an image from the Associated Press after Hurricane Katrina, where it was two white people who they're characterized as finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Katrina. But when it was an African-American male, it was a young man who walks through Chesapeake floodwaters after looting a grocery store. And this is what results in this kind of racial profiling, criminalization, police brutality, where people were actually shot, unarmed families just seeking food and seeking other relatives were seen as potential looters and shot and killed. They were tried, convicted, and given the death penalty in one fell swoop just for being Black on a bridge. And so I'm going to speed up because I only have 4 minutes left. Anyway, that was quick. So when we talk about climate forced migration, we know that whether it's the countries in many countries in the global South who are feeling the impacts heavily. In Central America, this is a report from NBC News, pray for rain or migrate. People who aren't able to have the crops that they had before are needing to migrate. And then when we have this kind of notion of climate-driven migration, and then when people come seeking refuge, instead of providing the sanctuary, even though we're 4% of the global population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, we instead put people in cages. So it's a quote from Warsan Shire, a Kenyan-born Somali poet: "You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." And so even as we talk about solutions, climate action planning often, again, results in displacement if not done right. We know the Elder Charles Band of the Biloxi Chinamaka Choctaw group that were displaced after the sea level, a combination of sea level rise and the sinking of the land from subsidence. And this is a story I would have told you, but with 3 minutes left, I'm just going to keep going through. But this is another story in Sand Branch, Texas, where this area was declared a floodplain, and therefore they're part of the FEMA buyout program, but they've only gotten $350 checks for homes and property that have been in their family for a couple of 100 years because it was a former freedmen settlement. But yet they don't get any services in the area because it was declared a floodplain, even though they've never had a flood in the 200+ year history of the community. So they have all of these problems as a result of not being able to develop their community. And so we know some of the forces behind, even in that area, there's a concern that people are trying to develop, and therefore that's why they're pushing people out of that land. And we know there's driving forces that are pulling the strings, again, on so much of this that is happening. And so this is a video I would have shown you, but with only 2 minutes left, I'm gonna kind of breeze through the solutions a little bit. So when we talk about just transition, transitioning from an extractive economy where enclosure of wealth, extractivism, and so forth are driving our economy now, which is really more of a corporatocracy. We're trying to move towards a living economy where caring for the sacred, including each other and including the earth, is critical. And looking at making sure that we have regenerative systems, that we have systems of cooperation, that we have systems of deep democracy. So contrary to the former schematic, when we think about managed retreat, we have to think about centering principles and practices around self-determination, democracy, reparations, keeping communities together, abundance, rejecting the myth of scarcity and embracing the notion of abundance, because we know that there are enough resources, there is enough, and cultural preservation, keeping in mind that that's critical for communities. So whether it's making sure that people have access to the data that they need to make decisions, this is a partnership between the NAACP and Climate Central, teaching people about the Surging Seas tool, helping folks to be able to have the data that they need to plan for what's going to happen in their communities. This is similarly, we took a group of coastal youth to Iceland on these $250 round trip fares to visit those ice caps that are ending up in their backyards now. The community planning, these are some of the measures. You'll have access to this, but in 23 seconds left, I'm gonna stop. Making sure that we're engaging local knowledge and in decision-making, engaging with legal support, like the Just Transition Movement Lawyering Institute, and again, following the principles of community leadership. These are just some quotes, including some of the practices put forth in the community-driven climate resilience planning that the Movement Strategy Center put together. So it's already happening. People are coming together, making sure that they are in the front of decision-making and community planning. And we see some of the what's being read from that. And I think we'll hear more from speakers around all of that. So thank you. It's 5 seconds to spare.
Jackie, that was simply amazing, and thank you so much. I really appreciate your presenting on that, and a hugely timely topic. I didn't mention Black Lives Matter or George Floyd as another thing that changes the context of where we're at in 2021 compared to where we were in 2019. So thank you for bringing all those issues to the fore and for the solutions. In the interest of time, I think we're going to move on to CITERs. And I did want to remind participants that they can use the chat and Q&A function, and we will bring those chats and Q&As to the attention of speakers. In this particular opening plenary, there's not a lot of wiggle room, so we'll do our best. Anyway, CITERs, I want to introduce you. And A.R. CITERs is an assistant professor in the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration and the Department of Geography, and a core faculty member of the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. CITERs research focuses on climate change adaptation, governance, decision-making, and evaluation. Her recent projects have focused on managed retreat as an adaptation strategy and the social justice implications of coastal adaptation. CITERs, over to you, and thank you so much for agreeing to present.
Thanks for having me this morning and for this amazing conference. It's incredible to see so many people thinking about managed retreat and about what that means for our communities and our future. I'm going to take my few minutes this morning to think a little bit about why this conference and the discussions that we're going to have this week are so critical. And this starts with the question of why managed retreat. Managed retreat is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly challenging. And I actually think that the reason we need to think about managed retreat and why it's interesting to think about managed retreat is because it is so challenging, that this challenge is a good thing. For academics like myself, taking on the difficult problems means that we learn more. Fields often advance by studying the most challenging cases, tackling the seemingly impossible problems. And sometimes they advance other fields in surprising ways. Managed retreat has long been one of the most controversial adaptation strategies, one of the most difficult to classify. Even today, there are debates as to whether it's an adaptation or a failure to adapt, and I'll get to that problematic framing in a minute. With the growing attention being paid to retreat, the research that you all are producing, we're not just learning about managed retreat, we're gaining insights into adaptation of all kinds, into environmental justice, into social justice, into development and governance. We're learning about what it means to adapt or fail to adapt. We're understanding how our governance systems are failing parts of our communities. We're learning about loss and heritage, about prioritizations, distributions of risk and resources, and about what it means for adaptation to be fair or just. Because managed retreat is so difficult, it forces us to consider hard questions in ways that other types of adaptation rarely do. For communities and practitioners, the fact that managed retreat is so difficult means that it helps us to challenge our assumptions and to have difficult conversations within our communities. We need to challenge our assumptions. We're making a lot of assumptions. It's going to be one of my messages today. It's an important issue to address. Too often, I feel like adaptation is working to keep the world the way it is, when we should be working to make the world better. A recent global adaptation mapping initiative surveyed almost 1,700 academic studies that document adaptation happening around the world. Only 14 of those were considered high depth, were considered a novel change, a radical departure from business as usual. Most adaptation strategies were considered so incremental, planting crops earlier in the season, turning on the air conditioning when you're hot, putting a sandbag in front of a flooding door, that reviewers and teammates questioned whether they should even be called adaptation. And yet that is the adaptation that we are seeing documented around the world, are these incremental questions. Especially when we frame adaptation as hazard mitigation, as disaster risk reduction, we can start to assume that the role of adaptation is to prevent those harms and to prevent change, instead of seeing it as a choice. Thinking about managed retreat can help us to reframe. Instead of assuming that everything should be preserved, we can start to ask critically what should be preserved. We can think critically about questions that have already been raised this morning, about who benefits from preserving the world the way it is, from maintaining the status quo. When we talk about preserving heritage and preserving culture, whose heritage is being preserved? Is it European? Is it colonial? Or is it indigenous? Is it community from minorities? Or is it the majority? Whose wealth are we preserving? And critically, of course, who bears the costs? Not just who pays to build the levee, but indirect costs. Who will lose access to the coast when we build seawalls? Who will experience the flooding downstream when we build levees on the river? Who will get too much sediment or too little? Whose ecosystems will be destroyed? Who can access elevated homes? Who's isolated in elevated community? These are the type of costs we need to consider far beyond the financial payment. All of these are questions about all types of adaptation. And at its core, adaptation is about choice. It's about choosing what we preserve, choosing what we let change, and choosing what we purposefully change, even when it feels like there are no other options but to retreat, when it feels least like a choice. There are still choices to be made about how retreat can occur, about when and where, about what we bring with, what we leave behind, about what is built at the new location. When we ignore that third element, the choice to purposefully change, we miss out on opportunities to improve and to do better. We miss out on opportunities to address inequity and historic injustices. We can start buying into the myth that this is as good as it gets, or worse yet, we buy into the idea that nothing has changed before, that this is the way it has always been. These are images of my hometown, of the city on the water where I grew up, of the place that is part of my identity, because I know that relocation is a major challenge for our place attachment, for our emotional desire to connect with our communities and places we are. I love my hometown. There are things in Duluth that are absolutely worth fighting for and preserving. And there are also things in this town that are worth changing and worth fighting to change. Duluth is one of the least racially diverse towns in the United States. It has a history of racism, sometimes a present of racism. It needs more affordable housing, like most places in the United States and the world. Personally, I wish it had walkable neighborhoods and more used bookstores. And it would be useless for me to wish that Duluth would remain the same, that it would prevent all change, that I could wrap it up in bubble wrap and pretend that the Duluth of my childhood was the best Duluth could possibly be. Because Duluth is going to change. Even when we stop climate change at 2 degrees of change, we will see other types of change. We will have millennials and AI-driven cars, and I was promised hoverboards. We'll have teleworking, we'll have virtual conferences. We will have things that will change the way we live and change the way our communities interact, even without climate change. In some ways, these towns have already changed, and that can be a good thing. Leaving Duluth helped me to understand which parts of Duluth I cherished the most. Now, I realize this isn't the same as communities who are facing the entire loss of their entire town, because I can go back to Duluth. Even if it's not the same, even if some of my favorite haunts are gone, I can go back. But thinking about leaving a place, even if we decide to stay, can help us to understand what makes that place so special. And when we know that, we can make better plans for the future based on what we want to preserve and what we want to change. Because adaptation can be exciting. If the Douglas Adams and Isaac Asimov quotes haven't already given it away, I read a lot of science fiction. I recommend it. I love the visions of the world, the way it could be, for better or for worse. And before anyone dismisses this as just fiction, think about how we use the shared socioeconomic pathways in the IPCC. Think about how we use scenario visions of the future. All are our best guess of what the world could look like to help us make decisions. I'm not suggesting that we decide to adapt to pursue any one of the futures portrayed in these books, but I do think that our visions of what climate change adaptation can achieve should match this level of ambition, that it should be about doing something new and audacious. I think we might be more creative and more ambitious if we flipped the story on its head. What if we didn't see retreat as defeat? What if we saw every decision to relocate as a brave advance? What if we saw every flood wall as a failure of imagination, a fallback option? We will build a levee when we can't do anything better or more creative. What if we flipped that narrative and tried to come up with things that were more audacious? There are so many ways the world could adapt. There are numerous tools out there, numerous advances, new technologies, new governance systems, new things being tried all the time. Just looking at coastal towns, we can imagine a whole variety of ways of living with the water, on the water, near the water. Places that will have giant walls because they'll decide that staying in place is worth losing access to the coast and losing the view. Places that will build floating cities on the water and deal with storms and ride out the waves because they want to be on the water, and that is important to them as a community. All of these are good options based on what the community wants to preserve. And retreat will play a role in each of these, sometimes a small one, sometimes a large one. But if we refuse retreat, if we take it off the table entirely, or if we fail to learn how to do it equitably and efficiently and to achieve these goals that people want, if we refuse retreat that way, then we will limit the futures that we can build. And that is the real problem. I know some of you are probably shaking your heads or you've already tuned out because I sound too idealistic, too naive. I already showed science fiction books on the page. This sounds too unscientific. And you have maybe seen firsthand how difficult retreat can be, how painful adaptation can be, making these choices can be. Maybe you're part of a community that saw the potential for retreat, not just to avoid flooding or wildfire, but to build something better. And you also saw how hard it is to achieve that. Many places have been unable to realize the potential of adaptation to do better. And our job, as I see it, as academics, as practitioners, as journalists, is to help communities to achieve those visions of the future, to achieve that better future, to give them the information and the tools that they need to make these decisions. You may have seen this curve. It's sometimes known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, or maybe more popularly as the imposter syndrome curve. The idea is that you learn a little, you become more confident, and then your confidence tanks as you realize how little you know, how much you don't know, before you finally gain it back through experience. And it turns out that this curve applies to fields as well as to people. And just to reflect on where we are in Managed Retreat, in 2019, I felt like we were here. I was optimistic, I was confident. We had 450 people attending a conference on Managed Retreat. Surely now we are going to see Managed Retreat take off and we're going to see some of these futures occurring. And over the last 2 years, we've seen so much good research come out that I actually now think we're here. I think we're coming down on this curve because we have more nuance, we have more details, but we also have more uncertainty. We have disagreement in the results that we're finding, and we still have some fundamental questions that we haven't answered. Please disagree with me. Please put a comment in the chat. Tell me where you think we are in this curve. I would love for you to disagree with me, to Alex's point on universities are a place for disagreement. So go forth. I think we're a little less confident today because we have these uncertainties, and there's quite a number we could talk about. You'll see them all throughout this conference. You'll see people whose results maybe don't align. Yeah, as Jackie Patterson just noted, equity is particularly complemented. We have whole sessions dedicated to equity because it is such a problematic issue. So many questions to be asked. How do we properly account for historic injustices? Do historic injustices mean we should give more resources for relocation or for staying in place? How should we enable communities to make their own choices about their future and about what that means? How do we support self-determination? How do we handle these kinds of decisions? Who should relocate? Who should be compensated? Should they be compensated at all? We often start from the presumption that, of course, voluntary relocation and high compensation lead to better outcomes, but is that true? Is it true in every case? What level of voluntariness, what level or mode of compensation is necessary? Compensation to the individual, to the community. Work from Canada, Austria, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, the Philippines, some being presented at this conference is complicating the picture that we thought we knew about compensation and voluntariness by showing a wide range of outcomes. Measuring outcomes itself is really tricky because, for example, the timing issue. When do we decide what the outcomes are of a relocation? Is it a month after someone moves, a year, a decade? What do we do when those outcomes change over time? When people's perceptions of the relocation itself change? How do we assess whether or not managed retreat has been successful? How do we even define successful retreat? What does that mean? There's so many practical details that we don't understand. When I first wrote about retreat in 2012, it was common knowledge that the best practice was to acquire large swaths of land at once. Well, I was wrong. It's not that clear, of course. The best strategy depends on context and goals. We're trying to get to the point where we can tell practitioners something like, if you are in context X and you use process Y, you are likely to achieve outcome Z. But we can't, because we don't have all the information about how to compare across contexts, across processes, and across outcomes. We're working towards this, but we don't have the confidence to predict that yet. And it raises an ethical dilemma. At what point do we advise about how to do retreat better when we have imperfect information? But also when doing nothing might also be harmful. How do we make decisions about responsibility as academics, as advisors, as practitioners on how much evidence we need to advise on how to do this process? So this is why I think we're heading towards a bit more uncertainty in the days ahead as we debate these issues. I also think it's because we have a few fundamental questions still unanswered in the field. Primarily, first and foremost, how is managed retreat different from other types of movement? Is it different from other types of movement? How is selling a flood-prone home to the government different from selling it on the private market, from home abandonment or disaster displacement? How is community relocation from climate change different from community relocation due to development or due to the loss of a local economy? What do we learn from shrinking cities and degrowth? If we can articulate clearly how managed retreat is different from these other types of movement, we are better positioned to be able to learn from those experiences, to compare managed retreat and contrast, and to understand what is unique and needs to be handled differently in this situation. I don't think this distinction has been clearly articulated to date, and I think this is a key question for the field to advance beyond some of the uncertainty that we experience now, and to leverage the advances that are happening in other fields and contribute to those. Second, managed retreat is harmful and beneficial. We can get so wrapped up in understanding how it harms communities and how it benefits them, and recent work, some of which will be presented this week, argues that it does both. It is both harmful and beneficial. But we have to think about the real questions, which are which benefits do people want and which harms are people willing to endure? And how do the harms and benefits of managed retreat compare to the harms and benefits of resistance, accommodation, avoidance? How do we help people make decisions when every single option has both harms and benefits? How do we navigate that? When we can't use just a straight cost benefit analysis, both for the equity issues that Jackie mentioned, but also because every option has too many costs. We need more work that compares managed retreat across other types of adaptation, that puts the same amount of attention on the social outcomes and on the equity of resistance, accommodation, and avoidance as it does on social outcomes of managed retreat. And without that work, I think we're going to continue to undervalue the role that managed retreat can play moving forward. Third, And finally, what does fair, equitable, or just managed retreat look like? I know these terms are unique and have distinct meanings, so I invite you to insert the term of your preference here. My point will be the same. We are getting better at spotting injustices and unfair practices in managed retreat, but we're still struggling to articulate what just managed retreat might look like, how it might happen as a process, who would decide, what scale of society, what kind of support it would require, how we would govern it, right? How we think about adaptation as being just when it also requires justice in housing, in education, in transportation, in provision of services, in so many other areas that are outside our silo of adaptation. How do we break down those silos to think about a more just society? These are questions that should apply to adaptation writ large, not just to managed retreat. But to return to my original point that adaptation, managed retreat is difficult. And it is this difficulty in managed retreat, the fact that it forces us to ask these really hard questions, that it puts them at the center, that will help us make better decisions in other areas of adaptation. And I am so looking forward to the rest of this conference to see how all of you are rising to that challenge to meet these hard questions head on. Thanks.
We invited you to give a keynote because we wanted to be inspired, and you did not disappoint. You've given us a lot to chew on. We are going to need to move to the next session, but thank you so much for a really excellent and thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we'll be carrying some of these themes with us forward over the next few days as we consider some of these really tough questions that the issues around managed retreat begs. So thank you.
Thanks.
So next I'm going to introduce the moderator of our opening plenary panel, which is on adaptation and retreat in coastal cities, perspectives from local government. We were really pleased that the New York City Office of Resilience reached out to us and basically asked to organize a panel that would bring together senior officials from a number of cities in the US and also in Canada. And so I'm going to just introduce the moderator, Carlos Martin, who will then go about introducing the individual panelists. Carlos Martin is a Rubenstein Fellow in the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program and a non-residential fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. So Carlos, please take it away and introduce your panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and the entire team at Columbia University, particularly to Haley. And special thanks to Jackie Patterson and Siders for their historical framing and the challenges to our papers. And I hope we can take those challenges throughout this entire discussion over the next few days. I think it's important that we also look at the layers of, to add on to Jackie's question about who is making decisions. I would think it's important for us to think about where these decisions are being made. And certainly in my work, I've looked at layers of governance from the global through the national down to the state. And certainly there are sessions that are going to be occurring throughout this conference on each of those specific geographies that we invite you to attend. But arguably the challenge of implementation is most acutely felt at the local level, at cities. Cities are not necessarily places that all nation states have always said are viable economically, socially, or environmentally. Some cities we know have been abandoned. Others have been burned to the ground. Still others have been enabled despite their context and circumstances. So climate change complicates these circumstances and its effects exacerbate both sudden and chronic changes. But it also threatens how local governments provide services to residents and communities, particularly those that we know are historically and politically marginalized and have constrained financial and political resources. So it's a pleasure to start this conference by focusing on cities. And it's a pleasure especially to introduce three very big experts on cities, representing three different cities across North America, from Vancouver to Miami-Dade County and New York City. So let's start talking about how climate change and adaptation are being dealt with in cities over the long term and the day-to-day. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the three separate panelists first, and then we're going to just dive into questions. We ask any attendees So please put your questions in the Q&A, and so we can line those up. We'll spend a good portion of the final bit of this discussion bringing those questions up. So first but not least, Angela Danielic is a senior sustainability specialist at the City of Vancouver, British Columbia. Angela is a biologist by training, but works across disciplines on climate adaptation to focus especially on sea level rising heat, as well as broader ecology and biodiversity. She has also served on the board for the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project, a British Columbia-based NGO that raises awareness about climate displacement. Second is Nicole Hefty, a Deputy Resilience Officer in Miami-Dade County, where she's been working since 1989. There, her responsibilities include coordinating and facilitating implementation of the county's climate change mitigation and adaptation initiatives. She has also served as the steering committee for the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact, an organization that we all know well on this in this discussion. She was a member of the core team responsible for Miami-Dade's sustainability plan, was also chief of the county's Office of Sustainability for a bit, and was involved in the Greater Miami and the Beaches collaboration under the 100 Resilient Cities program. And speaking of 100 Resilient Cities, our third panelist is Eric Wilson, Deputy Director for Land Use and Buildings in the Office of Climate Resiliency in New York City's Office of the Mayor. Prior, Eric was also Associate Director in the 100 Resilient Cities program itself, though he has held multiple positions in cities, particularly New York City, including as Assistant Commissioner for Planning and Pre-Development in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, Vice President for the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and as a planner in the Department of City Planning. Eric's expertise doesn't just live in New York City. He also was director for the Downtown Detroit Business Improvement and Planning Manager for the Abu Dhabi Urban Planning Council. So welcome all three of you. I'd ask you all three to unmute yourselves, because now we're going to get into it, as we say on my coast. So let's start off talking about what is actually happening in your three cities. We've talked about various kinds of adaptation. We are familiar with all of your plans and your resilience strategies, but particularly looking at formal retreat in your cities. What is happening? Let's start with you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carlos. And also, I want to take a second and thank Jackie and Siders for the framing that they provided at the onset of this event. I think they raised some really important issues that are at the front of our minds as we're trying to navigate these really complex topics. I also want to thank you and my fellow panelists for joining this conference, for joining this panel. These issues are really complicated. I think local governments are really grappling with these issues, so I really appreciate the thought leadership that they bring to this conversation today. So New York City, of course, is a highly exposed coastal city. We have 520 miles of coastline. We have 71,500 buildings within our current special flood hazard area, which is our 1% annual chance floodplain, with 400,000 residents that live in these areas. So we realize that we're going to need every tool in the toolbox to think about climate adaptation. Regarding the issue of retreat specifically, we're starting to think about this along a couple of lines. The first, and both of these are articulated in our draft comprehensive waterfront plan, which we just released together with the Department of City Planning. There's a chapter that articulates some of these goals. And so, this is detailed in that document. But in terms of housing, we really, as we started to think about what retreat might look like in New York City, we really wanted to ensure that our thinking is grounded in the people that live in our floodplains. How do we, we use this term flip the script. How do we, think about people instead of infrastructure and property, where I think sometimes urban planners, engineers, designers think immediately about the built environment. And we really wanted to start the conversation about housing. And at around the same time, actually just last year, the city released its housing equity plan called Where We Live, New York City, which articulates some of the systemic racism that's embedded in our land use policies that continues to cause segregated neighborhoods across our city now. And it really gave us some context, historic context about the housing inequities that we're continuing to grapple with. And as you start to layer on climate change, how these might continue to become more challenging. So as we set out to design a housing policy, we wanted to focus on this context of housing stability and how do we stabilize housing for residents who are going to be most vulnerable to sea level rise and its impacts. And we're starting to think about how could the city assist people, residents in their pursuit of stability by providing housing mobility programs. In other words, expanding upon buyout programs and ways that the local government can assist achieve a point of stability, either by reinforcing their home in an area that's currently facing risk or working with a household to relocate. Ultimately, I want to underscore that this decision must be one made in self-determination, that our role as a local government is to provide households, individuals with information about, and embark on a conversation with households that are at risk about what those risks mean and collaborate on what solutions might be able to work for that individual household.
Thanks, Eric. And I'm happy you brought up the issue of buyouts, because unfortunately that remains one of the few, I'm speaking specifically about post-disaster buyouts, one of the few vehicles that cities are actually employing. So I'm going to push you a little bit more on the buyout history in New York City, but first, I'd like to flip around and talk about a place that's not eligible for FEMA buyout programs or HUD CDBG-DR buyouts. And let's go to British Columbia with Angela. Angela, what's happening in Vancouver?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. I mean, Vancouver's pretty unusual in that, well, first, we have the most unaffordable real estate in the world. We don't have a history of coastal flooding in settler time. So since we've been here for the last 150 years. And so we don't have any flood management infrastructure in the city, or we have very little. And so when it comes to managed retreat, and because, yes, like you've said, some of the speakers have said, most of the decisions around flood management have been in the domain of planners or engineers. And that's part of the reason why I find this area so exciting, being neither of these, but speaking enough of their language to collaborate with them, is that we're flipping this traditional hierarchical engineering exercise on its head and borrowing from, from planners, but also environmental practitioners, and I would hope psychologists, and talking about values. And so we're making this a community-based value planning process. And when I've gone out and spoken to folks who live in these floodplain communities, I use managed retreat, or as we call it, avoid or move, because retreat can be really like confrontational and really challenge people and their sense of place. I use that as a container, as a frame to have that discussion, and that some, like Jackie and Siders were talking about, to really challenge our assumptions about why we live in a place or what we value, and start to have those conversations about trade-offs. So here in Vancouver, we are working along we have a river coastline, we have an ocean coastline. So I'm working with community to understand our community values. We did that in 2018 and 2020. And now this year and through to next year, we're going to be doing what is called the Sea to City Design Challenge. So it's kind of like a rebuild by design. And thanks to all the folks in the city of New York and San Francisco for coaching me the last couple years. But we're going to be focusing on coming up with new urban flood management typologies that will be based on community values and evaluated by them, so that we can move forward. And retreat is definitely part of the conversation, but in a range of ways. So yeah.
It's helpful to hear that that there is a range. I think what we're seeing so often, in particularly in larger U.S. cities and North American cities, is a gut reaction to defend and not really include retreat as one of the options. So I'm going to push all of you a little bit on this, starting with Nicole, because clearly Miami has been one area that has been particularly concerned with improvements in infrastructure. And you've been exposed to all of the planning that's occurred, not just in Miami-Dade County that you represent, but also the whole region. So talk a little bit about what is happening in terms of managed retreat there, please.
Well, thank you, Carlos. So obviously, I think, the word retreat is not a welcome word when you talk to our elected officials. And particularly in an area as beautiful as South Florida, we have, tourists are one of our primary economies. And so I think we're not thinking of retreat in leaving, but really more in making changes in maybe how we live and not only where we live. And so we started really looking at impacts from climate change in 2006 when we created a climate change advisory task, really honed in on sea level rise as a critical issue to prioritize. And so over time, we've had the ability to think about that in a very intentional way, and spent over 3 years developing the sea level rise strategy. And I think the key to that strategy has been a lot of the community engagement that we've done as a part of that process. And we're seeing climate gentrification already. And there's debate as to whether it's climate gentrification or it's just a matter of investors seeing the opportunity in blighted areas that happen.
Good old-fashioned gentrification.
Yeah, exactly. And so as we developed the strategy, we really thought about the impact to those communities. And similar to Vancouver and New York, we really looked at the typologies and the different communities. And we understand there's no silver bullet. So in our strategy, there are several different options for adaptation, depending on where you live, the community you live in, and the options available. And so we understand that is how we have to think about it. No one silver bullet. And we definitely are looking at buyouts. We did apply for CDBG funding, and we're looking at 10 properties that are scattered about, and we're going to see how this process proceeds and think about how we can utilize the lessons learned to perhaps do it on a broader scale. We have a pretty good history of actually voluntary programs to purchase lands for environmental preservation. And so we want to look at opportunities to maybe have that lens of climate change and how we can continue to live with water. It's a long history, and we can talk more about that. But the other huge component is the lack of affordable housing. And that was one of the major stresses that we identified in our Resilient 305 strategy, and something that is only going to worsen as a result of climate change and sea level rise. And so it's something that we really have to think about. A buyout program could mean, or a retreat could mean, losing some of those valuable properties that we need to think about, perhaps still being a part of our landscape for our adaptation and for housing. And so we have to think about very intentionally, how do we evaluate those different priorities. And a lot of the infrastructure and properties here are very valuable and are very expensive. So, there's the whole aspect of cost and who bears that cost. So as everyone has said, lots of challenges And I think that, you know, again, community engagement, we've seen that that makes a big difference, and that's what we're looking at going forward.
So I really appreciate you bringing up the existing context and existing challenges. Controlling for climate change effects, which is obviously something you can't control for. The sort of instinct that we have in all these three cities, and the reality is most cities in this country and on this planet, to either defend, do whole-scale defenses of these historic and valuable properties, and doing these trickling of buyouts where those resources exist, coming from typically from outside sources. So I do want to get a little more into the what are we waiting for and what are the hurdles. But before I do that, your comment, Nicole, regarding the existing challenges makes me think that, you know, in all of these three cases, all of your cities are not just subject to climate change's effects, particularly sea level rise and coastal climate effects, but you will be, so you're not only sending communities, but you're also going to be receiving communities for your broader regions. And I mean, Miami, the Miami-Dade area is probably going to be the epicenter of migrants coming from all over South America and the Caribbean when events are occurring there to which nobody is responding. So how are you dealing with that dichotomy as well? So you're doing infrastructure and tiny little buyout programs. You're trying to refigure out your existing communities. Are you planning for future residents, future migrants coming to your communities? Let's start with you, Nicole, in this one.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would say maybe not the epicenter, but we are certainly one of the primary localities that gets migration. I mean, we have for many, many years. And I think, you know, as a result of that, we are probably, you know, certainly better positioned than some other communities that haven't had that history, because we already have programs and social services set up to manage the folks that are coming in those situations. And so I think that I wouldn't say we're necessarily preparing for a mass influx, but I think that the fact that we've been experiencing this, and you know, certainly more recently with some of the hurricane events, we've had larger influxes. And so I think learning from those situations is going to position us to better understand how we're going to continue to manage that influx as we go forward. You know, so I think, you know, we're in a pretty good situation, at least foundationally, to prepare for that.
And I encourage all the attendees, if you're coming from different cities that are experiencing different scenarios, to put those questions and put your comments around what you're going on. Because clearly your sibling Floridian city of Orlando has at least given some lip service to the idea of being a climate receiving community and thinking about their existing affordable housing gap as just one tip of the iceberg for what they're going to have to project for their internal population growth, as well as the future migration, but potentially folks from Miami. So Angela and Eric, do any of you want to chime in on this idea of being both sender and receiver simultaneously?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. It's a great question, Carlos. You know, I think for the past several years, you know, New York City has been in an affordable housing crisis, and we've been building a lot of housing. And it's actually our belief that our floodplains will continue to be vital urban neighborhoods, you know, and we may even look at increasing residential densities in the portion of the floodplain where flood risks can be managed. We just need to be building more housing throughout the city. I think there's also a conversation to be had regionally. And we certainly haven't embarked on this process yet with our neighbors in Long Island, upstate New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. You know, we benefit from some of the best regional transportation infrastructure in North America. And we really need to think, I think, as a city, but certainly as a region, about accommodating more residents in places especially that are manageable for climate risks.
And then certainly it's an ongoing conversation that's playing out in some cases negatively. And in situ and live as we speak, where upzoning is occurring in parts of very precarious Rockaway, New York City, et cetera. So Angela, how about you?
Yeah, quickly, so I mean, Vancouver has definitely witnessed displacement of people due to a lot of different, typically in the past, governance changes, whether it was the handover in 1997 of Hong Kong, in the 70s and 80s, the Vietnamese boat people, and even recently the Syrian refugee crisis. And for a local government, we respond to those needs of those people directly. But it's interesting, their travel is handled by our federal and provincial governments. And so there's been groups of practitioners who've been advocating at the federal and provincial level to put a name to it, to put a name to climate displacement, because Canada, we are resource rich. We know that people will come here. And so recently, the province of British Columbia, where Vancouver is located in, has included, climate displacement as an adaptation effort that they need to investigate. And that's the first time that the province has ever stated that. And I think that's the first province in Canada to do that. So I think we will probably look to the past to see, where we struggled and where there were successes. And we know that our communities are very resilient, and there's so much richness there. And we've seen that even with COVID-19, that during that response, we got hit hard by not having effective, as a city, effective language services to enable people to communicate and to mitigate previous harm and stigmatism from the government, the white patriarchal government, working with communities of color. And so I think working like my colleagues in social planning, through their work, we hope to learn and prepare ourselves for folks who are being displaced because of climate change. And so I would say that, it's in that planning and stage, creating language and connecting language to concepts and starting to make maps of where people are at and how we can come together to co-create solutions.
I'm happy you brought up this idea, the issue of process, because clearly right now there's still a lot of discussion, planning, processing that's occurring in your cities as you're sort of figuring out what's going to happen and what you feasibly can do, while you have this big infrastructure, tiny buyouts that's occurring simultaneously. And I'm happy to say that the next line of question to get into is the details about the process, the processes that you've all been mentioning, from community engagement to addressing the vulnerable populations to your government silos. And the questions that are being fed to me that are coming from the attendees mirror a lot of these. So clearly people want to know about your processes. So I'm going to start off with a question about how do you even, what are you even relying on in terms of scientific projections for your planning, and how consistent are they across your city planning? For example, does the planning change if you're thinking about the likelihood of 2 meters or more by a specific year, like 2100 or earlier? Is there a standard that you're either borrowing from somebody else or using yourself? And I'm going to start with you, Nicole, because I know Miami is in the midst of a lot of this planning process right now.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, when the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact was formed, that was one of the first tasks that we took on, because in fact, that was one of the reasons we formed the coalition, because we realized that we were using different baselines, different projections, and obviously there aren't going to be those changes from county to county. And so we pulled together experts from the local universities, from the Water Management District, the Army Corps of Engineers, USGS, and we've been very fortunate to have an ongoing process where we establish the projections, and every 5 years or so, as needed, we pull experts together again to look at those projections and see if they need to be modified. And that's what we've been doing. And the most recent projection was released in 2020. And so those are the projections that the 4 counties that comprise the compact, Monroe, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, utilize for planning purposes. And we feel that they're defensible, and we have been able to again apply those amongst the 4 counties. We encourage the municipalities as well, 109 in the 4-county region, to also utilize those. And they're really one of the most important tools we have in South Florida for planning for sea level rise.
It's almost every planner's music to every planner's ears to hear that you're thinking regionally about these risks and trying to at least create a standard baseline projection and without the region. So
and if I could just comment really quickly, one of the state's priorities with the new resilience bill is to create a statewide projection, and we weighed in on that when they were doing the rulemaking, or I'm sorry, not the rulemaking, but the legislation, and really strongly suggested that it needs to be regionally at a minimum, because it does vary from region to region. There's no statewide projection that would really be very accurate at all. As accurate as a projection can be at this point.
That's exactly right. And the reality is that even some of the most progressive state governments in this country haven't really imposed a standard across their jurisdictions either, both for the reasons that you're stating, as well as I'm not sure whether there's no precedent for them to be able to do this sort of thing, right? So the number of questions that are coming in for you all is a bit astounding. So I'm trying to keep up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask one person per question, and the rest, the other two can weigh in. Feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So one of these issues was around the issue of scientific projections. The other is there the same kind of thing that's occurring at the federal government now with President Biden's request for an accounting of climate financial risks to the federal government that just occurred a couple of weeks ago. Is that happening in your cities? I'm going to go with Eric, because the question actually came in specifically about New York City's Economic Development Corporation and whether they're accounting for climate risks when they're supporting investment in projects.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And I'm not aware of any analysis that we're doing in-house to look at the economic impacts of climate change as a whole, citywide. I do think that that's something that we will need to embark on as we start to understand more and more about how climate change is really going to be affecting the city. I would say that City Council just passed a bill to require the use of our climate resiliency design guidelines for city infrastructure and buildings. And the goal here is to embed resilient design into new and substantially rehabilitated buildings and infrastructure. So we, reduce those risks proactively, ideally getting some kind of benefit at the end of the day and reducing financial exposure to the city and to its residents. But I think that would be an important analysis for us and others to conduct.
I imagine a lot of people are looking to the federal government to create some kind of protocol. So a lot of conversation should be held over the next 3 days in this conference about what the federal government is doing. I'm going to pass the next question to Angela, and it's one that all three of you discussed. It's about community engagement. Angela's given some particularly thoughtful insights into language, basic language, as well as communications processes. So this is obviously a big part of planning. It's a one way to at least feel like you're getting people's input. Angela, how are you defining and taking into account not just the methods that the city government is using to communicate with them, but are you listening?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think we are, because we are, like, I'm allowed to talk about things like managed retreat, or I'm allowed to, I mean, I shouldn't say allowed. The city is pretty supportive of me going out. At first there was a lot of anxiety amongst, especially the directors of engineering or the GMs there. They're like, but we don't have everything sorted. I'm like, that's right. That's okay. We can say we don't have it all figured out, and we're here to chat with you folks to see, what matters, what pathways should we, investigate.
I want to pause A city government official just said we don't have all the answers yet. Okay, this is a historic moment for everybody on this panel and everybody listening. I think this is a conversation that we always have, like,
yeah,
what are we doing wrong and how can we do it better?
Right. And I mean, you have to be sensitive and you have to be aware of people's anxieties, like, and when I mean like residents, citizens, community folks about this topic, and I am. And but like I think like Siders was kind of saying indirectly, there are opportunities to be hopeful here, and change is constant. And so we're going to get through this together. And so listening to people, I mean, that was the whole purpose of the endeavor or so far with community engagement. And so we did, you know, well, in real life before times, we did workshops, we did, you know, walking tours, we collaborated with local First Nation governments on their values and their interests, and then created written values and shared that back with community. And I'd like to say we're repeating that. And some people get, you know, they get a little bit antsy because, you know, they're like, where is the infrastructure? Where's the decision? And I'm like, we have some time here in Vancouver to be thoughtful and to really have those deep questions and break down the sticky bits. So I'd like to say that, you know, we are listening to people, but listening to people, and this is pretty basic. I feel like, you know, being on this panel with like New York and Miami, like it's like you guys have done so much complex things, but like even just hearing people, just listening to people. I'm able to do small group sessions, but listening to people and their stories about their place and their concerns, and have that discussion and really like break it down so that they feel heard. And so that's done in our engagement work, and it is something that we will repeat in the upcoming projects.
And this is
so Carlos, could I just
Yes.
comment? Yeah. So as I mentioned, we did very intentional engagement in developing the sea level rise strategy. We had many workshops, evening meetings where we had big poster boards, and we had the community come in, and you know, we explain, you know, what does sea level rise mean? What is climate change? And we actually had them look at, you know, here are the different options that we think we could consider. What would you like to see in your community? And so we were very intentional about that. Even during the pandemic, which obviously interrupted public in-person meetings, we had online meetings, we distributed flyers, just in a particular area that's one of kind of our first implementation actions of the strategy is our Little River Adaptation Action Area. And we've been very intentional there to listen to people because many of them have had repetitive flooding events and they've been impacted over the years and really, impacted by not just it's not sea level rise per se, but it's exacerbating heavy rain events. And so the other thing that is going to, I think, build on that, our new mayor, Mayor Levine Cava, is very, very much prioritizing community engagement. She just wrapped up a Thrive 305 campaign where we had a survey. We had over 10,000 responses. We had evening meetings where we got folks to talk about what's important to them. What are they concerned about? And so this mayor is really interested in not only listening, but taking action based on community input. And that even includes our budget process. So I think that we're going to see even a lot more of that going forward.
I was going to hold off on this question until later, but since you brought up the new mayor of Miami-Dade, I do want to bring up the fact that clearly New York City has a primary today, mayoral primary. And Vancouver has a municipal election next year. Politics obviously is going to play a big role in this, both politicians' perceptions of what their residents and their voters are going to say, as well as their ability to do things within their term. I believe Howard Conrad Wharton risks that, not in my term of office, was the new NIMBY for politicians. So Eric, since it's primary day, I'm picking on you first. Talk about
Yeah,
politics.
no, for sure. Carlos, this is, such a good question. And a lot of us as staff talk about this all the time and about what it might mean. I see this as a real opportunity. I think there's really growing awareness amongst New Yorkers about the climate risks that we face and the inequitable impacts of these climate risks. I think there's many different conversations evolving about what to do about it, but I'm just really grateful that all of the major candidates running in the primary today have at least mentioned the importance of climate adaptation, in addition to climate mitigation, reducing our city's carbon footprint, but specifically calling out challenging actions to protect New Yorkers from risk. There's varying levels of detail there, but I think this opportunity that we have as a community, not just city government, but through engagement with New Yorkers, public sector, private sector, philanthropic sector, is to really design what this process might look like and to have some content ready for the next administration, so that he or she once they're ready to go, we can hit the ground running on some of these really complicated conversations that we need to have.
Anybody else? Nobody else wants to weigh in on politics.
I mean, I guess I can. I mean, Vancouver Council, past and present, have been very supportive of climate action in both mitigation and adaptation, and we see that. And it's interesting with adaptation. I don't know about the other speakers, but there is I find some greater comfort with politicians at times with the adaptation sphere, because it seems as doing something and action and safety, and so that's nice. But I think for us in Vancouver, so for maybe who aren't familiar, Vancouver is on the unceded and traditional homeland of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and so that land was never ceded to the settler colonial government. It is theirs, but here we are today. And so adaptation, particularly coastal adaptation, it's an opportunity to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It's an opportunity to connect, restore the lands, and to decolonize our processes. So I think that is something that Council is really interested in, and I know a lot of my colleagues are very interested in.
Great. So an excellent question came in about whether, given the work that you're currently doing in the last 10 years, certainly points like the Hurricane Sandy were major turning points for places like New York City, whether there was actually a community that agreed to a managed retreat, at least the community at scale. And this kind of question is coming from Laura Gearing around whether there was consensus in a neighborhood within your cities around this. And I know I'm going to pass that first to Nicole, because you started mentioning the first project, the first community that you've been working intensely with. Has there been any kind of point in which there's an agreement or a schedule for that agreement to evolve?
No, not anything on such a large scale. As I mentioned, our buyout program is just 10 properties at this point, and they are scattered. We were hoping that there would be some that were, more contiguous, but I think that because we're a very multicultural community, I think that that'll be a challenge. There's been discussion about being very sensitive to keeping communities together, being sensitive to cultural values. And so I think that will be something that will certainly be more difficult to address, but we have not seen any large scale pull for that at all.
How about New York City? I mean, certainly in the post-Sandy movement, there was the additional buyout programs offered by the governor.
Yeah, the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. So there was one neighborhood that self-organized on the eastern shore of Staten Island called Oakwood Beach that, ultimately rallied for the governor to buy out their properties. I think these were residents who were exposed to repetitive flooding, and Sandy was provided the catalyst for them to organize, self-organize, create political pressure, and just do sort of a buyout en masse. I would say that we're thinking through buyout programs. I mentioned in my opening remarks that self-determination here is key. And we will not use eminent domain for this purpose. This is something that residents must, they're going to choose a path that is right for them. I think our job as a city government is to embark on a long conversation, household by household, and talk about risks, and create programs, both, buyout, leveraging federal funds where we can, but, our neighbors in New Jersey have been super creative about using other funds as well. But to the extent that we can really support those most financially and physically at risk, moving to a place of housing stability, but also reinforcing properties and working with vulnerable households to reinforce where they choose to do so. Our role as a city government is not to make the choice for them.
But the city government has made many choices for its residents over the history of your cities, right?
For sure.
Including telling them where they can build, how they can build, and encouraging and developing that. So the next question, I think, is an excellent one coming from Joyce Klein Rosenthal around this idea of fair market value. Because if we're dealing with this tension between community level buyout or managed retreat versus these individual properties, how are we accounting for equity issues when we're making these decisions? Because the reality is that cities have made these decisions, often and impose them particularly on communities of color, particularly Black communities in this country, and low-income communities. So how do we start thinking about this idea of, Joyce's question is primarily around fair market values that FEMA employs and its buyout calculation, but how are we thinking about this in terms of the legacies of segregation and redlining that your cities are particularly familiar with in terms of knowing exactly which neighborhoods have gone through this? I'm going to pass this one first to Nicole, given that there's this 10 property buyout within a bigger community, like how does racial equity in particular and income equity play into this conversation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, a lot of the coastal properties are very valuable. And so that's one of the things that we struggle with is that very issue of where are the priorities to save infrastructure and protect infrastructure. I mean, traditionally it's been those areas that are of a higher economic value. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. And again, because of our affordable housing issue and the gentrification we've seen, the areas that are more affordable to live in tend to be further away from the jobs. And so that puts a burden on those who have to move to those areas that are more affordable because they have to get to and from their jobs. We don't really have a great public transportation system. It's another stress that we identified in our strategy, our Resilient 305 strategy that we're trying to address and looking at how do we densify areas along our transportation corridor. So that's one of the key elements that we're going to be pushing to implement. And so I think that, the mayor created an Office of Equity and Inclusion. And I think that that is a particular issue that we will be in discussion with for them as they look at some of the priorities that they have to address. So I think it's their answers yet to come.
That's great to hear. Eric, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, so this is such a good question about fair market value. And, I think in New York today, New York City, so much of our post-disaster funding that we received after Hurricane Sandy had a degree of flexibility to it. So we're just starting to dip our toes into the federal programs that partner with local municipalities for this purpose of buyouts. And, in my opening comments, I said, we're trying to think about, flip the script, really think about the needs of households instead of a focus on property values. And this is this of course is a really interesting or really fundamental question about how do we continue to build intergenerational wealth especially in communities that had it extracted through redlining, forced highway displacement, predatory mortgages, gentrification, you name it. These things are continuing now. But they're dealing with this legacy. Now we have the layer of climate change. And how do we really focus on this issue of fair market value, shift and really understand the needs of the households? I think that's a lot of conversations that we need to have with those individuals. But FEMA has just issued a request for information about this very issue, about how their programs do exacerbate inequities. And
it closed yesterday.
Actually, they extended it.
Good to
July.
Hear. Oh, then why did I rush yesterday?
We need the time, Carlos. So this is one of the key issues that we intend to discuss.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I would just like to quickly, because I know like fair market value and buyouts in Canada, I mean, there's probably a lot of Canadian academics on the call. Like, it's still not well understood in Canada. We have just, maybe a handful of communities who have gone through a buyout program. But for context, like the federal government announced $2 billion worth of adaptation funding for Canada a couple years ago. And I can remember I was in San Francisco, like seeing the end of Resilient by Design, and I was so excited. And I was telling my colleagues there, and they're like, oh, that, okay. And they're like, I'm like, what? And they're like, oh, we have about, $13 billion in a tech fund just for the Bay Area that is like for adaptation. And I was like, okay, this is different. We are different. And so I think for Canadian cities, particularly Toronto and Vancouver, which are some of the most unaffordable places in the world, like this fair market value is really difficult for us to wrap our brains around. And like, how do we do that? And I really like Eric's point is how do we build intergenerational wealth, which we know comes from land properties, which we know has racist, foundations that need to be unpacked. Here in British Columbia, in Canada, there's a movement called Land Back, which was formed by Indigenous grassroots organizations on how do you connect Indigenous people back to their land? How do you enhance, support Indigenous sovereignty over their lands? And quite often in Vancouver, there is the Musqueam Indian Reserve in Vancouver. It's federal land, but it is Musqueam's land, even though it's a tiny portion of their unceded territories. And it's floodplain, which a lot of the reserves were placed in floodplains away from the better land. So there's all this to unpack. So when someone with their like $3 million condo in downtown Vancouver is like, well, how are you going to pay me? And I'm like, I don't know yet. I don't know yet, especially when I see those values go up anywhere this year, 300% in some places. Like, it's just, the real estate value is pretty bonkers here.
Yeah. And I'm happy you brought up the issue of individual property value, as well as which city governments have the economic resources to be able to intervene in that kind of fair market conversation. So the next question is about the do-re-mi. And I'm going to pass this to Nicole mainly specifically because Miami was the first city to create a climate, at least in name, specific bond, the Miami Forever Bond. Noting that's the city of Miami, not Miami-Dade County, which Nicole is coming from. But I mean, it's fairly a very progressive and aggressive strategy towards financing. So Nicole, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Miami Forever Bond and whether other parts of the Southeast Florida compact are thinking about this too.
Well, again, as you noted, it's actually the city of Miami bond. So it's not something I'm intricately familiar with, but it was something that the community supported. And I think if it weren't for the community engagement to push for the passing of that bond, it may not have passed. And I think that speaks volumes to the opportunity that the community has to influence a process, because you don't really see that too often. And so I think that the city of Miami really embraced that, and they're utilizing that to completely upgrade and rehaul their stormwater system, which is so key. And, you know, I would just say that one of the things that we're struggling with as well, that's part of this whole big picture, is our septic tank issue. And that is a very prevalent, not only Miami-Dade County, but also within municipalities as well. And we've identified, 103,000 systems, septic systems, that we anticipate are either already failing or subject to fail by 2040. And so that's a bigger picture process that is extremely costly, because not only is it costly for the homeowner to connect if the sewer system is abutting their property, but if there is no sewer system abutting their property, then the issue is much more challenging and expensive to address. And a lot of that cost is borne by the homeowner. And so we're currently looking at innovative ways that we can actually pay for that, those upgrades. And again, looking at not only federal dollars, but state dollars as well. And the state has identified funding specifically for that, not only here for Miami-Dade County, but statewide as well. It is a statewide issue. The county has a long history of bond programs, and we don't specifically have a resilience bond, but it's something that was considered in the former administration. So we're hoping that will be considered in this administration, and particularly a lot of the federal dollars that we didn't expect pre-pandemic. We're looking at how we can take advantage of those in our adaptation and resilience planning for infrastructure.
That's good to hear. And I imagine we're going to be hearing a lot of interesting financing schemes coming from a lot of the coastal cities in the US. And the one that I can think of after Miami being the leading was Houston, particularly the Harris County Stormwater District, that passed its bond immediately or relatively immediately after Hurricane Harvey. And we've seen that the implementation, the revenue that's coming in from that bond has been used by Lena Hidalgo to fund specifically disinvested, historically underinvested communities in the Houston area. And there's gotten some backlash about that. So I'd like to ask Eric the next question about this very issue about, we're talking about places like Miami, New York City, Houston, even Vancouver, that have resources that at least can entertain thinking about how to fund adaptation, managed retreat in some capacity. But what about cities that don't have the kind of intellectual capital and the political clout and the financial resources? You're the biggest city in North America. What would you say to these smaller cities?
That's a really good one, Carlos. There's so many areas to start. I think I would do two things at once. I would really dig into getting to know what risks are, what climate risks are in my community, try to mine data sources as much as possible at the national scale, state scale, to the extent that your county has done some work to forecast climate risks. I would get to know what are those projections for the future. At the same time, I'm looking at the data, I would start talking to people, and especially talking to communities of color, talking to low-income communities adjacent to waterways, those that might be experiencing heat. Those are some of our biggest climate impacts in the East Coast for sure. But I think, starting from the academic projections and climate projections, equipping yourself with that information, equipping yourself with the information about the lived experience are the places that I think I would start, but that's a real challenge. I talk about this with our partners in New Jersey, who at the state level work with many, many, many small municipalities along the coast of varying level of capacity. It's a problem.
And so we have less than 5 minutes because we want to give Alex a chance to wrap up. So I do want to give you, Angela and Nicole, quick questions that came in that I think are really important that we need to hear from, but if you can answer briefly. For Angela in particular, knowing your biologist background, about environmental decision making, environmental decommissioning, rewilding. It was a good question that came in around how are the environmental considerations being thought of in your city, because cities are human settlements, and so we haven't talked about the environment in these places. So Angela, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, the city of Vancouver, the fact they have a biologist at the helm, yeah, I'm using this process to undo the past harm and to, revitalize our shoreline from its, 50s, 70s rip-wrapped nightmare to do what we can. And so, but being cheeky aside, there is our federal government in its last climate plan dispersed a whole bunch of funding for nature-based solutions for adaptation. So nationally, the conversation is being had, and provincially in BC, we have a green shores, type, which is very common. We probably ripped it from Oregon and Washington State, to be frank. So I would say that restoration is part of this conversation, and it's just growing. We know that those solutions have many benefits, and the tent is widening in terms of the discussion amongst practitioners. So yes, it's there.
Right. And the last question that's going specifically to Nicole is about the law, about cities' legal obligations. And I think this particularly is an area that Florida is sort of ground zero on. I'm specifically thinking Thomas Rupert's groundbreaking legal work in Florida around governmental public obligations. How has this played out in Miami-Dade, or is it playing out yet?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Thomas Rupert. He's actually been a part of the compact and helped to educate us on some of those legalities. And, I'm not really sure where we're headed with that. We had an interesting situation when we were looking at identifying areas vulnerable to sea level rise. And on one side of the coin, the assertion was, well, we need to inform people so that they know that they're, considering investing in an area that's vulnerable. And on the other side of the coin, we had folks saying, well, but then the county could be liable for takings if you provide that information. And so it's an interesting question, and I think it's something that we're certainly still grappling with.
So thank you, all three of you, for such amazing responses. So very quick and streaming questions that continue to come in. We're told that we are encouraged to go back to the hub and answer questions, because we can answer questions in there throughout the conference. And so there's a lineup of questions that are still aimed at you all. But I do want to note, just close out before passing it back to Alex, that this whole conversation has been about cities, about the intense, dense, human and vibrant human settlements that our cities are. It's important to say the Biden administration has made climate a top priority, but has been a bit mum on displacement and managed retreat in particular. I'd say the only exception I would know of is the specific mention of the American Jobs Act on transition and relocation assistance to support community-led transition for tribal communities. And certainly there are urban tribal communities, but the level, the quantity of vulnerable communities is much larger, certainly in the United States. So keep up the conversation. I'm going to ask the three panelists to go on the hub and answer one more question about what they would do, what they would ask of the Biden administration for cities. And Angela, you get a pass, but you have to write it for Trudeau. All right. Thanks again for the panelists, and Alex, back to you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. It's great.
Wow. Thanks, Carlos, for an excellent job in moderating a very lively panel with lots of great questions from the audience. Thanks too for Angela, Nicole, and Eric's candid assessment of the status of planning on managed retreat in their respective cities. It's actually a coincidence that while the panel was going on, my smartphone thought to remind me of photos I took 2 years ago during the 2019 managed retreat field trip to Red Hook, Brooklyn, which was led by Tad Pulowski, a Columbia School of Architecture and Planning professor who also lives there. And I found it a fascinating look at the issues on the ground concerning individuals and communities that are most exposed to sea level rise. And it brings home all the equity, the cultural, the historical, the emotional, and many other issues raised by managed retreat. This highlights what Siders was saying during her keynote about how challenging these issues are and why there is a need for creative minds, scientific input, and gifted, honest, humble, and compassionate government officials, such as those that we had on our panel today. So thank you so much. I should have mentioned at the outset that we do have a hashtag on Twitter for our conference. It's Managed Retreat CU 2021. So if you want to send out tweets about anything you've heard today, use the hashtag again, Managed Retreat CU Columbia University 2021. We will return at 10:31, and we look forward to seeing you in one of those 3 panel sessions at that time. Thank you so much. And this ends the opening plenary.